I want to welcome you back to another episode of what I branded Pivotal, since these interview style segments tackle impactful CPG industry topics and lessons from the business leaders that live it every day. You remember that most interesting man in the world, those Equis beer advertising campaign that ran from, I think, 2006 to 2018? It seemed like each episode's montage of experiences layered on even more curiosity, which has some similarity to this episode's guest, Samyr Laine. While it wasn't mentioned in our conversation, his time at Harvard also briefly included being Mark Zuckerberg's roommate. But then you'll hear briefly that interesting life included a 2012 Summer Olympics appearance, law school, then working for Major League Soccer, Jay-Z, and Will Smith before becoming a consumer focused venture capitalist. Since much of that journey happened at the intersection of talent, brand, and culture, that's where my conversation with Samyr stayed, which provides some excellent depth of insights. We analyzed the evolution of talent involvement within consumer packaged goods and detailed our most valuable non negotiables when it comes to being successful as a talent led brand. Samyr and I also explained why we believe this is still early innings of building celebrity brands, but also the transition strategy required for more exit events. Moreover, we talked about the nuance between creators, athletes, and celebrities that could make or break a talent led consumer brand. But these are just some of the fascinating topics we chatted about in this episode. So, without further delay, here is the recent conversation I had with Samyr Laine. So, this might be a little bit of a weird way to open the conversation. My audience is probably aware and they know this is par for the course, but Samyr, you don't know me all that well. So, this is, I think we briefly off camera talked about this, but like adolescent Josh, if he was kind of like closing his eyes and visualizing his dream life, like really, there's a lot of close adjacencies to your actual real life. I mean, professional athlete, we had different kind of, loves, turned lawyer, and then was able to kind of work within culturally, impactful consumer categories. I mean, I think I ended up detouring in a few times, and I had my own kind of different versions of like pinch me as this real moments. But ultimately we ended up playing in the same sandbox eventually. So Samyr, overall, thanks for spending some time with me. Thanks for giving me some time. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, no, of course, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, and always great to connect with someone who's taken the circuitous route to where they've ended up. So.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit. Let's go through a little bit of the journey a little bit, because I think it provides a good base for what we're going to be talking about. I think I mentioned, you have the educational background that kind of plays around with athletics, and then sports, entertainment, talent. Now you're doing VC stuff. Like, give me just kind of the audience a quick rundown of how you got here.
Yeah. I will take the quick approach. I mean, for me, in college and even before going to college, I had the ambition of going to law school. My goal while applying to law schools in college was go to law school to figure out how to get into the sports world, right? To work at the intersection of sports, business, and the law. Through college, I was an athlete, and what ended up happening was during my senior year at Harvard, where I was a captain of the team. I'd been an NCAA All-American my junior year, so had high hopes for how my senior year was going to go. I ended up getting hurt for my outdoor season. And by then I'd already applied to law school and gotten into Georgetown and was committed to going there. But with an injury, I told Georgetown I need one more year to use my extra season of eligibility somewhere. I went to the University of Texas, got a master's degree there, also kind of opened my eyes to what really, really, really high level university competition was like, and beyond. I had teammates who went on to be NFL greats. Some went on to be Olympic medalists and world champions and so on and so forth. So at Texas, I kind of got a chance to understand what professional track and field was like. And so I went there for a year, got a master's degree in kinesiology and sports management, and then actually went back on the path I was destined to be on to Georgetown for law school. After law school, I actually spent some time as a professional track and field athlete, as you mentioned, but at the end of my athletic career, started working in sports. Spent a few years in DC working at Monumental Sports and Entertainment. So in the NBA, WNBA, NHL world, moved back home to New York, spent a couple years working at Major League Soccer, was very, very happy, and thought that like I did it. Went to law school. I'm working in the sports world. I actually loved what I was doing because I was kind of close to the player side of it. I was doing player agreements and team salary caps. And then I had a recruiter kind of whisper in my ear and pull me away from the sports world into the talent, entertainment, and eventually consumer world. But a lot of it just had to do with saying yes to opportunities, and trying to figure things out after the fact. But really, my goal, I thought I'd accomplished it, having been at Major League Soccer, being really, really happy, being at the league when it was a great time for what the league's ambitions were. They were adding teams and bringing on great players. But it really was a roundabout path to get there, because after law school, I spent almost 10 years in professional track and field, basically trying to pretend like I didn't pass the bar exam or go to law school at all. And then found my way to sports, and then my way out of sports. So it was quite the road. And then to venture now, like you said. So a little bit of hopping around.
In that time away, like moving from sports into, I think what we call it, talent or entertainment or whatever. I mean, I think you humbly are not mentioning the names that you worked for, but big names like Jay-Z and I think Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith's and they had, I think both of their businesses, they have so many different arms of it. And I think both service and consumer and brand and kind of all the types of things. And really, I don't think if you roll them all up, it's really at the end of the day like stories. Like they're all different ways to tell stories. Which like
Will would love hearing you say that.
Yeah, I mean, because I think about it's funny because my background is very analytical and I'm numbers based, and a lot of the strategy type stuff is based on these big frameworks and things that we all learned in college. But at the end of the day, I kind of bring it back to like stories are what pulls all this together. Like if it's selling a packaged good, or if you're selling, a movie, or you're selling even, selling yourself or a sports athlete or whatever that is, like these stories are what really bring people together, because that's what's always brought people together. And it's, and it's hard to like, those are the artistic expressions. So like a lot of times I stay and I play in the packaged goods space, but a lot of times I tell people like at the end of the day, it's stories. So like if you could tell stories well, you could really kind of move yourself around anywhere.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And so, so spent a couple years at Rock Nation working for Desiree Perez, who's now CEO, but also for Jay-Z, of course, and doing a lot of Rock Nation things, helping manage a couple artists there, but working on a lot of Jay's businesses in particular. And then, as you mentioned, came out to the West Coast to join Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith at Westbrook. But it is all about storytelling, right? Whether you're leveraging talent to help tell that story, to help reach a broader audience, whether you're selling a CPG brand or yourself, it's about how you craft that story to your audience. And at times, your audience is a consumer or a client or a prospective client. But a lot of it is about storytelling. And then when I got to Westbrook, I was there pretty early as we were setting the foundation, but Will and Jada had this vision for Westbrook being a place where creatives could tell stories, right? And so creatives and artists, and that artist could be an athlete. You might be an artist on the field or court, or that athlete could take their artistry into something else and help tell their story in a different manner. I mean, LeBron and a ton of people do it in spirits. Now LeBron has his Lobos tequila, right? But now when he talks about the wolf pack and build a bigger table, he's telling a story and that he's crafting that story and trying to reach a consumer that connects with it in a meaningful way, and then convert that storytelling into buying activity. But 1,000%, I think all of it is about storytelling. And then for me, having seen Jay leverage his cultural cachet as he's building his not just building Rock Nation, but then building his brands. The same for Will, and so on. I think all of it links to storytelling, and that's the approach that I take as well, right? Because if you're not a great communicator and storyteller, you're not going to land the clients or convert the consumers or sell the product or whatever it is.
And at Freedom Trail Capital, your guys' VC consumer fund that you guys created, and where we're going to kind of go with this conversation is really that celebrity packaged goods, talent led brands, this kind of idea that you inject a talent or personality to a good of some sort. And I think we'll stick mostly with like CPG, and a lot of your early investments I think are in CPG, at least initially, but I know you guys are category agnostic in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of whatever's kind of available. But my bread and butter is CPG, so I think
Yep.
we'll kind of stay mostly there. But I want to talk a little bit of like the evolution of talent involvement, because originally it was very transactional. It was very much,
Yeah.
we think back, I guess pre-internet, really a lot of that is coming from a standpoint of endorsement deals. They were a big part, I think, of celebrities' ability to create wealth was to kind
Mm-hmm.
of attach their name to things, but it's very transactional, very much like, here's my pitch to something. And then it's from the internet standpoint, I really think because of maybe digital platforms and their ability to share things on there and giving the access to people that love to have like parasocial relationships with these celebrities, like you then have the ability to kind of disrupt and have this idea of like creating things that speak to you because people know you much better. It wasn't just like what the gatekeepers say or whatever it
Yeah.
is. So then it opened up so much more opportunity. It's taken some time, I think, for it to get to an alignment purpose. And I'd argue maybe it's still not fully there, but I do
Yep.
think it's been an interesting probably 25-ish 30 years of like the evolution, and now we're in this like, I don't know, golden age, I feel like, of like talent led brands.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I think a part of it is, and for our fund, we kind of have borrowed from Mark Andreessen or Andreessen Hort, right? Like
Mhm.
legendary VC investor. But I think a couple months ago he mentioned that he saw talent-led brands as the future of consumer, right? And so it's funny to say that they're the future of consumer because a lot of people, to your point, think that that's all they see. But it has been an evolution to where we are now, where it's going to be the future because people don't have those parasocial relationships with the Unilevers and Procter and Gamble's anymore, or the brands themselves. It's more with these people whose lives they're getting a glimpse of. But a lot of it, to your point, is started with, and I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Air, right? Which great movie on
Yeah.
Amazon. Ben Affleck and Viola Davis and a few other people. But I wouldn't even venture to say that Michael Jordan was the first, but he was very, very early on where it was like, I'm not going to just exchange my name and likeness for cash. His mother clearly being the one who was like, I also want a piece of equity, right? Now it's
Yeah.
made him very, 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 very wealthy, and he doesn't have to lift a finger. He makes hundreds of $1 millions a year from it. All the way to today, where you get to this place where, and Beyonce mentions it in a song, "Pay me in equity," right? And so now you get the idea of, and I also tell prospective LPs this when they want to understand what our fund is doing. I tell founders this. I think this connection with talent has always been there because it is about storytelling, and sometimes you want to use talent to help tell whatever story or craft whatever web you're weaving. And the exchange before was simply like dollars and cents for name and likeness, and here, hold this Gatorade bottle and so on. And now it's a very similar relationship, but the talent is saying, pay me in equity, just like Beyonce, right? So it's not simply a royalty or cash. Most of them have enough cash at this point. A lot of it is, I want to be a partner. I want to help build whatever you're building. Pay me in equity and let's figure it out down the line, right? I want to be along for the ride. And so sometimes the talent isn't, actually previously the talent wasn't actually along for the ride. You get 50 Cent, right, with his vitamin water deal,
Yeah.
where it was, we do a commercial, pay me in equity, I'll come back and collect down the line. And nowadays you get this, to your point, evolution where talent is actually building and they are more so along for the ride, right? They're either founding and they have a founding idea, or they're a founding partner, or they come along early enough where they have a significant stake in the company and they say, I'm here with you, not necessarily every day because they're not operating, but they're like, I'm in it for the long haul, right? And so I think brands have evolved in a sense too, right? Like it's unlikely that you'd get a vitamin water 50 Cent deal where it's, do this commercial, perform for us, we'll give you a tiny piece of equity. I think nowadays brands are also on the flip side saying, let's build together, right? You have a community, you have a fan base, you've got this authentic connection to someone or something. We as a brand want to leverage that. Let's join forces and build something bigger. But it's a great point. It has been an evolution. It has been over 20, 30 years. I think it's still evolving. And to Mark Andreessen's point, I do think and agree that it's the future of consumer, right? Because nowadays, you want people kind of don't have time to explore everything or try every tequila, right? But they're like, all right, I like this guy. He's got this tequila. It tastes decent enough. I'm just going to fast track it. I think that's where people are nowadays. Or it's the same thing with cosmetics or whatever it is, right? I see this person. I love how they do their makeup, and you walk into a Sephora and it's overwhelming. I'm just going to fast track because I know it's trusted by Rihanna, for example. So if Rihanna trusts it, I'm going to trust it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I think I remember a handful or two years ago, I made a comment around just the idea that I thought, if it's drones or like cameramen, like people were going to, and it's kind of evolved now with, I think, TikTok Live and things like that, where people are just going to kind of live stream their whole day. And then whatever those people are just naturally doing, I think currently the phase is that they're promoting other people's products, and they're kind of just naturally putting those things into play into some kind of like shop attainment where like you're getting entertained, but you're also getting some utility or necessity out of the process, and you're doing it. But like eventually those even smaller creators start creating their own thing, and they start just, wherever. And I agree with what you're saying about, Mark and Dries saying that the future, because really it's like every single person becomes, a brand in some sense. And yes, there's going to be some that are followers and some people that are going to be out there, doing their thing. But like it changes the whole landscape of consumer, which maybe gets into some conversations we'll talk about later about like, what does that mean ultimately for like the, the expectations and things like that. But I do think like, where we're at now, it's, and you mentioned a few different times, like there are other elements, especially when we're talking about CPG, that have to be in place for these things to do well. Talent is not always, created equal. I think also, product, if we're talking consumer goods, something consumable or something like CPG specifically, is like, you got to have a great product, and that product not only has to be great, but it has to be right. Like it has to be aligned with that particular talent. So like, it has to be like, does that talent understand like they're defining personality traits? Like, can they, aestheticize or articulate like what makes them special, and how do they make that become a product that's unique and different and great, comparable to like what's else out there? Because if you don't match and do that, like you're never going to create any longevity and velocities and pull through long term. And then it's like you mentioned another one around like, they're not going to be the ones, or at least the hope is they're not going to be the ones that operate. They pick the right partners that have that background that can do those things. So then they could do what they do best, and the operators can do what they love. Like myself, like I would never want to be in the limelight all the time, which maybe sounds funny for some people because I have my own YouTube channel and I have my own whatever. But at the end of the day, like I'm a introverted person that would rather be in the shadows. My whole life has been like the strategist behind the brands that are pulling the strings like a puppet. Like I don't like to be part of that. So at the end of the day, like I like to, sit in the weeds and crunch the supply chain and the margins and the, channel strategies. I don't want to be, out there like playing a character and doing those things. So like, but the talent, they love that kind of stuff. And it's like, that works well because that ends up being, but I think there's a lot of like missteps that happen across the board because maybe this talent wants to do too much, or they pick the wrong products or categories, or they pick the wrong operators. There's so many kind of like missteps that seem to be happening.
Yeah. What I've seen is, you said you made a few great points, right? Like for us, for starters, with our fund, our approach is we look at talent last, right? For a few reasons. A, there are instances where we invest in an amazing company, an amazing product, and great founder, and we might bring talent in after the fact, right? So we've got a couple brands in the portfolio that don't have talent yet, and we're like, all right, we speak to the founders about, do you want to bring someone in? Who is that person that makes sense? What's the archetype for a person that could authentically tell this story, right? But our diligence approach begins with the product. Is this product differentiated? Is it an amazing product? Does it have a reason for being on shelf or in store or just out in the world, right? Because at some point, I tell people like, please don't bring me another celebrity tequila. Don't. Just even do. I would even do mezcal, like just another part of the agave leaf. I don't want it. And so it does start. And then beyond another celebrity tequila, I want to know like, all right, if it's celebrity tequila, is it is it truly the best out there, right? So for us as a fund, we do start with, is this a different product? Is it an amazing product? Does it have a reason for being out there? Then we move on to the brand, right? Like What's the name? Why the name? Why the colors? Why the font? And a lot, like, we'll ask the founders, what's the genesis? What was the genesis of this name and this brand? What's the brand hierarchy? When it appears on shelf, how did you want consumers to react to it? Like, that brand piece of it is big for us because a lot of times people don't put enough thought into it. But even branding, the psychology behind branding is both an art and a science. And then the next thing for us is like, what's the team? Who's running it? What's their background? Why are they involved? How are they involved? Then the actual fourth consideration is the talent. But like everything else has to line up first for you to have a great company, great product, great brand that you can actually have talent be a part of and have that authentic connection, right? And then, the other piece that you mentioned, which is spot on, is a lot of times, sometimes talent don't know how to leverage themselves alongside a brand in a way that is synergistic and additive to that brand, right? Because sometimes it's just like, cool, I'll slap my name on it and we're good. And it doesn't work like that. Especially doesn't work like that anymore, where consumers are looking for authenticity. They're looking for, and they're also calling BS a lot quicker. But because it's storytelling, people can like right off the rip tell if this is just a name slap and a money grab, right? And so a lot of times, talent may not know how to appear alongside or in a brand story in a way that adds to the brand. But sometimes the management team or the executives don't know how to leverage talent appropriately either. And so what I found, and it works for us from a fun perspective, because I've been on the talent side, I've been on the brand side, I've kind of worked in the middle of it. Sometimes you do need someone who speaks talent and someone who speaks operator to kind of bridge the gap, right? Where you can say to the executive, who might be an amazing executive, have you thought about leveraging and utilizing the talent in this way so that it actually helps your brand and the business? And then you can speak to talent and say like, look, this brand and this team need you to appear in this manner, right? And so it's not as simple as slapping a name on it anymore. It's not as simple as holding a product and like waving and doing the hand gestures anymore. It really is more about understanding the talent, understanding their community, their power, their messaging, and independently. And then also when you combine that with what the brand is trying to do, what the operators are trying to do, what the impact, what the effect of that is, right? Because sometimes talent story and brand story, if you just mash it together, might not work, right? So you got to figure out how to make sure that the two are able to not just coexist, but coexist in a way that, again, is beneficial to the brand. So you're spot on, right? Because sometimes the product and the brand and the talent just don't mix, but B, the messaging behind it may just be a little bit off, right? And a lot of times the operators don't have the experience with the talent as well. So I'm like, I'm an operator, right? But you get folks who are just like running the business, squeezing the margins. We got a great product. We got to do this, the supply chain and so on and so forth. You bring talent in, you're like, cool, like bring that famous person and put their name on it, and we should be good. And it doesn't end up working like that or that easily. And so you just got to figure out how to craft the right story in a way that actually lands in the way you intend it to land.
Yeah, I think it's a good point around the translation between the two parties too, because I think that especially when we're talking about some of the operators that, maybe have the cachet or the interest to kind of leverage talent-led brands, like they are, the quote unquote old heads that maybe have been around, like they're used to the period of time when you would pay somebody a check and you say, do it the way we want you to do it. And when you're done, we move on and we got what we needed to get out of this and we go forward. Where this is more of that, partnership where there's that alignment that needs to happen, where you need those creators or celebrities or athletes or entertainers or whatever to be themselves, to have that. And then on the flip side, the entertainers or the talent or whatever they are, they're so used to being themselves to the fullest extent that sometimes they need to be like, hey, that's awesome, I love that, but I also need you to be something that's intersecting into what we're doing that makes this make sense, because if that's not aligned, that's just not going to work.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And it's also understanding the instances where you rely on talent and say like, I had the script, here are the points we need to hit, how do you want to do it and how would you say it, and so on and so forth. And there are other instances where you also need to realize like, man, this talent actually doesn't know how to connect their message to our message as a brand, or B, sometimes talent just doesn't understand like what their fan base or community is looking for, right? I've had instances where You got something working, talent's like, man, I want to do it this way. And you're like, I don't think that's who your consumer actually is. I don't think that's who your demographic. Like you're gonna say that, it's gonna turn off your core fan base, and like, this is how I want to do it. And you're like, okay, here we go. And then you try it that way, and people are turned off, and you're like, look, this is who your fan actually is. You might, and it might be a somewhat distorted version of yourself, and you might not be able to keep it as real as you want to keep it. But your fan, like you drive a Rolls Royce Cullinan, you do X, Y, and Z, blah, blah, but that's not necessarily your demographic, and that's not who you're speaking to, right? And so you might wear $100 t-shirts, but your fan base doesn't want you to sell them $100 t-shirt, right? Like there are just certain things where sometimes you've got to speak to talent or management about, look, this is how we feel the best way. This is what we feel is the best way for this person to marry with our brand, and this is how we think we're going to make 1 + 1 = 3, quote unquote. But no, it's spot on. And again, like I said, sometimes operators, like an operator, their job is to understand how to best build their brand, what the brand story is, and so on and so forth. And you hopefully have someone who can translate, which is perfect word, who can translate that talent message into a brand message, mix the two together into a cohesive message, and then put it out there into the world. But yeah, I think there are some people who've done a tremendous job of it as well, right? I mentioned Rihanna before. The Rock is another one where he's got a team, but he's also experienced enough and mature enough where he understands how people. I think people who are doing it well understand like their message, the story they're telling, and they can, to some extent, understand how it's being perceived and received, right? And so sometimes they've got people telling them that. I'm sure that's part of it as well. But The Rock is someone who's like, he's got an energy drink, he's got tequila, now he's got a skincare, men care line, all that stuff. But at some point in his messaging, he gets people who are like, man, like The Rock feels very genuine. I know, and I see him working out all the time, but I'm sure he actually drinks his Zoa energy drink before. Like, it seems so authentic. You're like, I believe that he's drinking Zoa when he walks in the gym, and then when he's out partying, he's drinking his tequila, and then before he goes to party, he's using his skin. Like, it's that authentic, and the messaging is so on point because people are like, I'd love to hang with The Rock, and if I'm hanging with The Rock, I'm sure I'm drinking Terramana, and if I want to work out with The Rock, I'm sure I'm drinking Zoa and energy drink, and all of that is just tied to, I think, the authenticity that he brings to bear, but it is knowing the story you're telling and how people are both receiving and perceiving. And there's a long list of people who do it really well. I think that list will get longer because, as we said, it's the future of consumer, but that's a key piece of it.
Which I think is a good transition. I think we both agree that, if this is the future and this, a lot of people argue like, oh, we're at this point of, and I hate the word like saturation because I feel like it's the wrong use of an economic term. A lot of people just misuse it or whatever, because like at the end of the day, like talent-led brands, if it's done correctly, it's inherently distinct and unique. And in that sense, it always has, its own unique market. It doesn't necessarily need to be thought of as something that even maybe takes from somebody else. Like, it's going to have its own place if it's done right. Now, if it's just a Me Too, or if it's something that's, just whatever, like that's a whole different subject. But I think there's a flip side to this is like, we can both agree that there's probably an endless amount of these things that could happen. But I also think, another flip side of that is to think about, diminishing marginal returns, of the idea that like, if we keep creating competitors, we ultimately like the expectations or like the idea of like how big these things can get on a, individual level get minimized a little bit over time. Now there's always going to be a breakthrough or an outlier or whatever that is. But like, when you're considering this from your side, like you also have to kind of, I guess like discount a little bit around, taking maybe some of these early outliers that people pick from. They go, oh, hey, Rock with Terramana, or they look at Prime, or they look at, whatever it is. And they go, we're going to do that, but we're going to do it with this category. And because of that, we're going to make X, Y, Z. And you go, okay, but you have to also place in that the idea that there's a ton more competition and there's a ton more whatever. And it's like this idea that like both things can exist in the same. We can create a bunch, but we also need to understand that like, there's not an infinite amount of dollars that'll get spent on these categories. And eventually it hits some constraint, and, it's not going to fully take away the Unilevers and the Nestle's and the whatever, because they have their own place. They have their own reasons for
Yep.
being in existence as well.
Yep. And look, at the end of the day, like I'm on the investment side now, right? Because I'm no longer operating and staying up all day, all night. And I stay up all day, all night thinking on the investment side, but not on the operational side thinking about those things. But on the investment side, those Unilevers and Procter and Gamble's and Coca-Cola's, those strategics have a place because you hope that you're creating something that is appealing enough to them that maybe there's some sort of liquidity event or M&A activity or something down the line, right? But because those places are able to, like, our fund and talent might be able to get an opportunity and product from 0 to 1.5, but to get them from 1.5 to 2 to 3 and so on, there are instances where those strategics add a ton of value, right? They've just got vertically integrated systems, supply chains that sometimes you've built something where you hand it off to them. So they absolutely do and will have a place. But you're right. There isn't an infinite amount of dollars or products or shelf space nowadays. But I think for us, what we look at it is there are still a lot of people on the planet. And so we take a global approach. And one of our general partners is actually London based, right? And so we love to take a global approach, especially with our thesis. I think our thesis does travel across borders. But beyond that, there's at some point you get to a place where competition ramps up, right? I think last I heard, Mr. Beast Feastables candy bars, I haven't pressure tested, but 400 million revenue, top line revenue this year, right? And so, but at some point he was very early into a category. You will get copycats, and eventually there's a place where like you get a ton of chocolate bars. I think Mr. Beast is still going to be far and away the outlier, but yeah, people like you get this paradox of choice where sometimes there are too many choices and too much competition. People just don't want it. They're like, I'm going to move on. Or B, the competition cannibalizes each other, and so you can't build something as big as you could have when you were first or second or third, and now you're the 18th tequila on a shelf, and it just fragments the entire segment, right? But at some point, I think if you're building it, just like we said, if you're building it need and product first and with quality in mind, I think you're still able to build things that are big enough that it's a worthwhile endeavor for the talent and for the entrepreneur, right? Like at some point you're trying to solve a problem with a product. And so, sometimes that product is like this thing that tastes like this isn't on shelf yet. So it's not necessarily solving a problem, but the problem is that it doesn't exist, right? So you're trying to figure out what the niche is, what the white space is, and kind of shoot the gap a little bit, right? And so if you're building it with that in mind, I think you can still build sizable things, right? And but you do have to be aware of the competition. You do have to be aware of copycats coming after you, or if you're, again, like we said, like Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul did a mezcal instead of a tequila, right? So at some point they're kind of sort of competing with tequila, but they're not. And so for them, they saw the landscape and like, let's do something different. Now there hasn't been like huge M&A activity in mezcal yet. I imagine it's coming, but they were among the first, right? And now you can kind of get into that space in a different way. So I agree. I think you've got to be aware of the competition. The competition does, to some extent, decrease what your upside is. But if you're building a great business with a great product, I think you can cut through the noise, and you can inevitably use talent to cut through the noise if you've got the right talent connected to the right company.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think the one category that seems to have the most, at least liquidity events, has been alcohol. And then when you move into some of the other kind of categories, there isn't as many of them. And that's mostly probably because I think we haven't hit the life cycles yet that a lot of these brands have hit that point. And then also, I think depending on certain categories have, I think, a closeness to the talent than other ones, where like tequila or like any of those brands, like I'd argue that yes, that maybe gets people to buy something the first time, but I think over time you probably transition away from maybe not necessarily supporting it only because it's The Rock's or it's George Clooney's or it's, whatever, or Ryan Reynolds or whatever that is, where like I think some of the other ones, maybe there is a little bit of a more close aspect. And maybe that's also because it's, the buyers of those people of an alcohol is much older, and they understand, the game of life, and they understand that eventually those people want to sell their business and they want to transition away and they don't want to be the figurehead forever. Where a candy bar, like if Hershey's bought Feastables, they don't need the IP in the sense of like, they don't need how he makes the chocolate or any, like contract
Yep.
manufacturers did all that. So like the end of the day, like Hershey's knows how to make all of that. They don't need any of that. They need Mr. Beast. But
Yep.
does, Jimmy Donaldson want to be selling chocolate bars for the next 50 years? Does he want to be Willy Wonka, in movies when he's 75 or not?
Right.
Because that's something that is going to be a concern for like the exits, because again,
Yeah.
if his team wants to run that, and like you said, $400 million, and maybe it's, it's probably more interesting for a private equity firm or something like that
Yeah,
to probably
at
figure out a
style,
way
sure.
to like, come out, than it is a strategic, because they look at it as like, I want the talent with that. And then,
Yeah.
if you're another example, like Logan Paul and KSI at Prime, it's like, do those guys want to be selling electrolyte waters for the rest of their lives? No, they want to go do something else. And eventually that's going to transition away. And it's like the attractiveness for PepsiCo or Coca-Cola, like they want their brains, they want the ability to how they hack algorithms and
Yeah.
the ability to hack culture and understand how to do that. They don't want, what's the liquid in the bottle.
No,
like they know
no.
how to do that better than them.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you do get both. Like in the spirit space, I think the idea that talent has this weird connection to spirits that because people are used to it nowadays. It's odd because spirits is actually tougher in my mind. My opinion is that it's tougher for talent to cut through in the spirit space than it is elsewhere, right? Because you don't really have D2C. You have this 3-tier system in the US. So with spirits, what has to happen is I've got to see The Rock or Conor McGregor with their alcohol. Then I have to go to the liquor store and remember that. Like, it's not like I see a Facebook ad with The Rock. I'm like, oh, I love The Rock. Let me buy this tequila and have it delivered, right? Like, so spirits, in my mind, is tougher because there isn't this immediate transaction that takes place. And so as you're fighting for mind share as a result, when you go to a liquor store, you see Terramana and you're remembering The Rock, or you see Casamigos, you're remembering George Clooney or something to that effect. Whereas in other spaces, you might see Selena Gomez with Rare Beauty and you're like, cool, like I see a Facebook ad, I can buy it immediately. I love Selena and I'm transacting right away. So it's always odd that like spirits has been the place where talent, I think outwardly, like for people who aren't necessarily behind the scenes, where talent has had the most success. I think there are other places as well, right? Like hair care and cosmetics nowadays and other places, but spirits is unique in that the strategics have no problem spending, right? And saying, and I've talked to everyone you can imagine. What they say is, we're not as great as building culturally relevant brands that are connected to people, right? Like to get from that 0 to 1.5 I alluded to before, the big conglomerates and strategics are like, that's not our game. We can't do that. We don't do that anymore. But talent can do it, and then we'll throw a check at talent to kind of bring them into our house of brands. But what happens in spirits, and I think it is happening elsewhere, and you mentioned Mr. Beast, is that talent sometimes has an earn out, right? Like the deal in a Casamigos acquisition might be $1 billion, but there are still back end deliverables that talent have where they've got to earn this, whatever the back end is. And so if you're a Hershey's or a Mondelez or whoever, and you're like, cool, let's acquire Feastables, but do a licensing deal with Jimmy/Mr. Beast and have an earn out where, it might be $1 billion deal. He gets 400, probably more, but he gets 600 million up front, but to earn the remaining 400 million, he's got to stay alongside us for another 4 years. He's got to be a part of the brand. He's got to do X, Y, and Z. And in that earnout time, it is the strategic's job to kind of milk as much as possible from that talent in that time, and then B, build the brand so that it can actually stand distinct from the talent who's built it, right? Like Feastables is, I think, on its own doing a good enough job of getting there. Casamigos as well, right? Like you're probably at a place now where most people drinking Casamigos don't even remember what movies or TV shows George Clooney was in, and a lot of them don't even know George Clooney anymore. But no offense to him, but I think you get into a place now where Prime is so closely connected to Jake and KSI that if it were to be acquired, they for sure would have provisions where they have to stay alongside the brand. In that time, it is the strategic's job to kind of like divorce it from the talent, and if done well, that divorcing the brand from talent happens beforehand, right? Like the sort of investments that we look at are the ones that aren't being built on a talent's back, that don't succeed solely because talent's involved. Like if that's what you've built, then you have a little bit of an issue. And so, to your point, I can't imagine Mr. Beast wants to be peddling candy bars for the rest of his life. And so if there is some sort of acquisition, PE or otherwise, or Mondelez, I do think that, yeah, it does come with his involvement for a couple of years. I think that involvement kind of elongates his connection to the brand, but eventually he gets to ride off into the sunset, just like what typically happens in spirits, right? And so in talent, and sometimes the brand is built such that it's already independent of the talent, right? Talent has done a good enough job for the 3, 4, 5, 6 years that they built it, that they're able to like hand off to a strategic and say, you can take the baton from here.
I'm interested to get your take on some of the, I guess, nuance or differences. I mean, both positives and negatives that you see when you're working. I mean, you've worked, close to a lot of these different famous people very closely. And the idea that, there's creators, which I kind of view their power really with their idea that they understand the kingmakers today, these like ever-changing algorithms, like they're ears to the ground. They're in the platforms every day. And because of that, they understand that aspect, and like they understand maybe what they need to do to get attention. And arguably that fame probably is more volatile because I think they don't have a lot of gatekeepers other than the algorithms, but like they don't have a lot of gatekeepers where like a entertainer or, a sports, an athlete or, some type of celebrity, like there is somebody within there that has a lot of money that's attached to them as a gatekeeper, that like they want to support them and make sure that like they don't fall. And I think that has the ability to create a little bit, I guess, easier understanding of like the longevity of their star power, because, you have TikTok that makes somebody famous and all of a sudden they launch something and then within 15 minutes they're gone. And you're like, okay, what
it's a flash in the pan a lot of times,
Yeah.
unfortunately. No, it's true. It's interesting because that's also a question mark when it comes to, I think, influencer-led brands. We just talked about Prime and Feastables, right? Like, so clearly it can and will be done. Even like brands from big podcast hosts, I think, are and will be a much bigger deal. I think, to your point, like a podcast is a more lasting endeavor, and so the celebrity podcast host probably has more lasting star power than a TikTok influencer. But at some point, it's a big consideration, right? Like, how long will this person's how solid is this person's connection to their community and their fan base? How lasting will it be if we bring them or we build a brand around them? How long are we setting ourselves up for failure when this person's 15 minutes of fame is over? Or are we able to kind of leverage that and maybe extend it through this product that they're building, right? And so now, like, Jake Paul has done it outside of Prime, but if there's probably a scenario where Jake Paul had just a TikTok star, built Prime, and then leveraged Prime to kind of extend his stardom, right? And so it's a really interesting question, especially now that you have the age of the TikTok star, the age of the influencer, and the question is what that will look like as they become brand builders, and how solid a foundation is building a brand with a TikTok star versus building a brand with a movie star, right? And so to your point, I think it's a part of it remains to be seen for sure. I think a part of it will take careful consideration around how did this person get into how did this person become an influencer and start? And also the other piece of it is sometimes those TikTok stars, even though it is a flash in the pan 15 minutes of fame thing, again, they've created this parasocial relationship with their fan base and their community, and it's actually very meaningful, right? Where they speak and the fan base listens or the community listens, right? And so sometimes you actually get more authentic connections to that community than you do with a football player or a movie star, right? Like, it's very interesting to see. I've seen NFL players who you think you launch, and I've seen them have worked with, right? NFL superstars, mega stars, and you're like, this person should be selling way more merch than this, but the actual connection to the fan base is not as close as it is in the case of some TikTok stars, right? And so It's really really interesting. But I like the idea, and I like the thesis that like you have gatekeepers, or you have or had, you have less now, fewer nowadays, but you had gatekeepers um, who had a vested interest in the extended stardom of certain pillars, right? Movie stars or musicians for sure, right? Because you had record labels who were like, they need this person's third album to be as successful as their first album, so they are setting the foundation for them to extend their stardom. And in TikTok, you don't have that as much, so it's something to be aware of, something to I think for people who are building brands with TikTok stars and influencers to be careful of. But by no means do I think that a TikTok star led brand can't be successful, because we've seen otherwise. We've seen influencers do tremendous jobs. They've built their cachet on YouTube or TikTok, and they've parlayed that into a brand that's doing really really well.
Yeah, and I think some of these ones, especially we're talking, athletes, and I think if we're talking maybe entertainers or musicians or something like that, a lot of them have to get, and I think this is changing very rapidly now, but like you have to get away from the facade of like, I'm this, if we're using male athletes or something, like the toughness, or like I have to be this, warrior or whatever, and you get into, as an example, something like Jason Kelsey or something like that, like pulls this into like, I'm just a normal, father, husband, like I'm joking around with my brother, I'm doing this kind of
Yeah,
stuff, I'm doing all that. Like you show so many layers, and then somebody that is a fan of you because your playing skill, that's great. They would buy your jersey maybe, or they root for your
yeah,
team. But like when you start to then talk about other things and you want to sell whatever, it's the other layers that ultimately get people to be attached and interested and creates connectivity,
yeah,
because that's really what most people see in themselves, is like, oh, that's just another guy. I see him in my, like, I love that he's a great dad, or I love that this is that. I don't
yeah,
care that he could push around other 300-pound men, because I can't. Like, there's no
yeah,
relatability to that. But the relatability is that, hey, this dude is busy as hell, and he's doing all this stuff with his kids and his brother's family and whatever. Like, he seems like a good guy. And if he's going to pitch something that is relatable to me, then hey, I might support him, because I want to support, that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
That's no, I couldn't have said it better. It's The Rock having tea parties with his daughter, letting his
Yeah.
daughter paint his face or paint his nails, and it's Jason. The podcast has helped, right? So I do think that the podcast with his brother has opened him up to the world, but he's also kind of let down his guard a bit, right? And so a lot of times you're absolutely right, because that's what actually builds the meaningful connection with the consumer. And beyond just buying jerseys, now so the Kelsey brothers get involved with a craft beer brand, right? So now it's beyond just, can you buy my jersey? It's, I want to have this connection with you that extends beyond you being my fan of what I do on the gridiron, to you understanding me as a person, being connected to me as a father and a husband and a brother. And then parlaying that into the storytelling we spoke about at the outset, which hopefully begets some sort of consumer activity or transactional activity when you connect Jason or whoever else to a brand or a company.
Well, I love the conversation, Samyr. I mean, I think we could probably talk forever,
Yeah.
but I'm going to be, definitely courteous to both of our schedules. But thank you again for the conversation and the time you gave me.
Yeah. No, thank you. Like I said, could talk about it all day, but I appreciate it as well.
I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. If you did, consider hitting that like button to support me. Also, help me get to my new short-term goal of 4,000 subscribers by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to see you join me on this journey, but we need to fix the fact that I think slightly over 90% of you at this point that are watching this YouTube video are not subscribed to my channel, and that makes me extremely sad. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.